Arthur knelt in the damp morning grass, the crisp autumn air feeling thin and sharp in his lungs. Splintered orange fragments of what was once Goliath, his 800-pound pumpkin, lay scattered across his lawn like the aftermath of a violent shipwreck. This wasn't just a vegetable. It was his hope for paying off the piling medical bills, a single, fragile shot at financial relief. As despair settled over him, he heard a condescending chuckle from next door, where his new, wealthy neighbor Sterling watched from his pristine porch, a smug look on his face. It's amazing how a single moment can feel like the end of the world, and how quickly a person's true colors can show in the face of another's loss. We'd love to hear if you've ever witnessed a moment where someone's small act of cruelty was met with unexpected justice, so stick around and share your thoughts in the comments. The sight of Sterling's smirk sent a tremor of cold rage through Arthur's weary body. He pushed himself up, his knees cracking in protest. For 4 months, every single day from the last frost of spring to this cool October morning, he had poured his life into that pumpkin. He had tended the soil, protected the vine from pests, and measured its growth with the pride of a father watching his child. Goliath wasn't just a potential prize winner at the state fair. It was the embodiment of his refusal to give in to the mountain of debt his late wife's illness had left him. The $5,000 grand prize wouldn't solve everything, but it would have been a lifeline, a breath of air when he felt like he was drowning. Now, it was just compost, a monument to his failure. His daughter Corinne pulled into the driveway then, her beat-up sedan rattling to a stop. She was bringing him groceries, a weekly ritual that filled Arthur with both gratitude and shame. At 30, she had her own life, her own struggles, yet she always made time for him. When she got out of the car and saw the pumpkin patch, she stopped dead. "Dad? What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Arthur couldn't bring himself to look at her. He just gestured vaguely toward Sterling's house. "He happened," he mumbled, the words tasting like ash. Corinne's eyes followed his gesture and narrowed as she saw Sterling, still standing on his porch, now swirling a drink in his hand. She marched right to the edge of her father's property line. "Did you do this?" she yelled, her voice echoing in the quiet morning. Sterling took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his tone dripping with false innocence. "But I will say, your father's lawn is finally starting to look respectable. That orange monstrosity was a real eyesore." The sheer arrogance of the man was breathtaking. Corinne turned back to her father. "We're calling the police," she said, her voice firm. Arthur just shook his head, the fight draining out of him. "And say what, sweetheart? That we think he did it? There's no proof. It's his word against ours. A man like that," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "a man with his money and his lawyers. We can't win." He looked at the wreckage of Goliath, and for the first time, Corinne saw him as truly defeated. He wasn't just a man who had lost a pumpkin. He was a man who had lost his last ounce of hope. That rejection of her help, that deep, hollow surrender, hurt more than Sterling's smugness. It was the real crisis. Corinne spent the next 2 days trying to rally her father's spirits, but it was no use. He would just sit in his armchair, staring out the window at the remains of his hard work. She knew the root of his despair wasn't just the money. It was the injustice. It was the feeling of being powerless against someone who could destroy a piece of your world for no reason other than spite and get away with it. The police had come, just as she'd insisted, but they could do little. Officer Miller was sympathetic, but he confirmed Arthur's fears. Without a witness or any physical evidence, a formal accusation was pointless. It was the word of a retired handyman against a wealthy financier who lived in a modern glass and steel mansion that made their modest bungalow look like a garden shed. The external antagonist wasn't just Sterling. It was a system that seemed built to protect men like him. Corinne felt a growing frustration. She baked his favorite cookies, brought over old photo albums, and tried to talk about anything other than the pumpkin. Nothing worked. It was like a light inside him had been switched off. On the third evening, as she was about to leave, feeling utterly defeated herself, she noticed a new, glinting object on the corner of Sterling's roof. It was a security camera, small and sleek, with a dark, unblinking lens, and it was pointed directly at her father's front yard. An image flashed in her mind. Sterling at a neighborhood block party a month ago, bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about his new, impenetrable security system. "Top of the line," he had boasted, puffing his chest out. "Records in 4K, night vision, the works. I can see every blade of grass on my property, and a good bit of everyone else's too." At the time, she'd rolled her eyes at his arrogance. Now, his words felt like a gift. She felt a jolt of adrenaline, the first glimmer of hope. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "Do you remember Mr. Sterling bragging about his new cameras?" Arthur looked up, a flicker of interest in his tired eyes. "I suppose so," he said. "He's always bragging about something." "His camera," Corinne said, walking to the window and pointing. "It's aimed right at the pumpkin patch. If he did it, he recorded himself doing it." This new approach, this tangible piece of possibility, seemed to cut through his despair. For the first time in days, Arthur stood up and walked to the window, following her gaze. He saw the camera, and a slow, calculating look replaced the emptiness in his eyes. The first small win wasn't a victory yet, but it was a plan. The next morning, Corinne and Arthur went back to the police station. They spoke to Officer Miller again, this time with a specific request. "We have reason to believe the act of vandalism was recorded on the suspect's own security camera," Corinne explained calmly. Officer Miller listened intently, stroking his chin. "That's a strong theory," he admitted. "But I can't just go over there and demand the footage. I'll need a warrant for that." The process, he explained, would take time. They needed to present a judge with enough probable cause to justify a search of Sterling's private property, which included his digital cloud storage. It was a major setback. Every day that passed felt like another victory for Sterling. Arthur's newfound hope began to waver. "He'll delete it," he said to Corinne on the drive home. "A smart man like that, he'll realize his mistake and wipe the recordings clean." It was a real possibility, and the thought hung between them, heavy and suffocating. But that evening, Sterling's arrogance once again became his own worst enemy. As Arthur was taking out the trash, Sterling called over from his perfectly manicured lawn. "Heard you went to see the police again," he said with a smirk. "Still trying to blame your gardening failures on me?" Arthur's hands clenched. "You know what you did?" Sterling laughed, a short barking sound. "Proving it is another matter entirely. My property is my property. My recordings are my recordings. You and your little girl can't touch me. You should learn your place." It was meant to intimidate, to make Arthur feel small and powerless, but it had the opposite effect. Sterling's taunt was a confession in everything but name. His overconfidence was the final piece they needed. The next day, Corinne relayed the conversation to Officer Miller. The direct taunting, combined with the camera's clear line of sight, was enough. The judge signed the warrant. The final test came 2 days later. 2 police cruisers pulled up quietly in front of Sterling's mansion. Officer Miller and another officer walked up the long stone-paved driveway and knocked on the massive oak door. Arthur and Corinne watched from their living room window. They saw Sterling answer, his confident posture immediately faltering at the sight of the warrant in Officer Miller's hand. He was legally compelled to provide access to his security system's cloud account. The climax of the story didn't happen with a dramatic shout or a physical confrontation. It happened silently, in a digital folder. An hour later, Officer Miller came to their door. He held his phone out for them to see. The video was crystal clear, even in the grainy night vision. It showed Sterling, his face illuminated by a motion-activated floodlight, creeping into their yard. It showed him kicking the pumpkin again and again with a look of pure, childish rage on his face. Then, as if to add insult to injury, he produced a small knife and carved a mocking smiley face into the largest remaining piece. It was all there. Undeniable. The shared victory was quiet, but profound. As Officer Miller walked back to his car, they saw the other officer escorting Sterling out of his house, his hands cuffed behind his back. The smugness was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He had been so sure of his own cleverness, so certain of his superiority, that he had never considered his own high-tech toy could be his downfall. The end was a new beginning. Sterling was charged with vandalism and destruction of property. A judge, disgusted by the blatant malice of the act, ordered him to pay Arthur $10,000 in restitution, double the prize money, plus a hefty fine. The story became a local legend, a cautionary tale about how arrogance can be a self-inflicted wound. But the real change was in Arthur. The money helped, of course, but it was the justice that truly healed him. The following spring, he tilled the soil in the same spot where Goliath had grown. He planted a new seed, but this time he also planted 10 smaller ones in a new patch by the sidewalk. A neighbor, seeing him work, asked what he was doing. "This one's for the competition," Arthur said, patting the soil over the large seed. "But these," he said, gesturing to the smaller patch, "these are for any kid in the neighborhood who wants to learn how to grow something." He was no longer just a man trying to save himself. He was a man helping others grow. What do you think is the biggest difference between someone who makes a mistake and learns from it and someone who, like Sterling, seems incapable of seeing their own faults? We believe these stories hold important lessons, and we're grateful to share them with a community that appreciates them. If you found value in this story, we invite you to subscribe and join the conversation.